Thanks, Alfie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back after lunch. As he said, I'm Keith May. As it says on there, I work for Historic England in my day job, but as Historic England is also an independent research organisation, I've been fortunate enough to get a couple of UKRI AHRC grants, and with my fellowships, I'm actually going to be presenting mostly on the outcomes and work we've done on these research projects with that research funding from UKRI. I should also credit that it allows me to work with partners. So you'll see I'm crediting Dr. James Taylor from York University, and Kenneth Aitchison and Doug Rox McQueen were also involved in parts of these projects. And with that, I will move on. And we're moving. So what I would like to dig in terms of the presentation is try to talk about some of the problems, some of the work we were trying to do and problems we encountered with particularly the reuse part of FAIR. I put unfair on that slide, but it's one of the challenges. A lot of my research work over the years has been looking more at the sort of findable, the accessible, and in making things interoperable, which we've made progress with. But there is still a lack of interoperability and reuse in our data sets. And I'm looking at two projects really to deal with that. The first one I'll talk about briefly was the first project called The Matrix, which was looking at how we could improve sort of post-ex analysis practices, make them more consistent. I was in the session yesterday around kind of lessons learned on the big major projects post-excavation, and the word consistency was very much used by a lot of those presentations. We're focusing particularly in this, I'm going to look mostly at the reuse of stratigraphic data, particularly, and dating evidence from records and archives and post-excavation in particular, and how we can make that better. And then issues that came up leading on to the second project, which is the one that's the headline here, the Archaeology, what we call the Archaeologist's Guide to Good Practice Handbook. And I'll say a bit more about that as we go through. So the Matrix project, initially the idea was to go around and sort of talk to some of the major contracting units in the country, hopefully understand their post-excavation processes, and by kind of consolidating and finding consistent areas, we could do some working with their data to map data together and do research on the stratigraphic and dating evidence. But what we found, there was a lot of issues, and there was like, I've summarized here kind of nine key elements that we found that had a real effect on what led to sort of variability and unfairness in archaeological data, particularly in the archives, and suggestions how we could signpost some of these better. Now, in particular, I'm just going to highlight three here to just give you a flavor. That obviously methodological choices are key. Now, we in this country do a lot of work on single context planning. That is our main methodology, and it's been widely adopted as a kind of de facto standard for our process. But I've also been working with European colleagues, so there are other ways in which people are also recording this data, which would be useful if you want to share excavation data and post-excavation data across different countries. Other things that obviously key to how variability comes in is, as I sort of talking about, the post-excavation lessons learned, digital practice, and how our digital practices change and develop over time is very much something we have to be able to manage in the same way that things will continue to change. I don't think we're going to actually get to the point where we're not bringing in new digital practices as we go forward. And finally, the last one there was around sort of dealing more philosophically with how we work with data, what I'd call sort of data about the present. So things like measurement data, we found a burnt stratigraphic context that was this wide, but there's also the fillers there. Then we lead to the sort of things we make in post-excavation, which are statements about, yes, but that burnt thing that was 50 centimeters wide, and we're interpreting that as a half or some other burning cause and effect. So diving in again, the problem really around this was how we could approach the issues around interoperability and reusability. As I say, the idea, I did interview on the project some of the major archaeological organisations, and we kind of worked on the basis that there are these typical project stages, going through excavation to assessment to to post-excavation and publication and archive. Well, we also identified that to some extent there was there's two sides to the archaeological river, if you like. The flow of information flows through, but on one side there's what people do in like what we call research funded projects. So if you get sort of funding from one of the research council, or you're in a university and you're doing a research dig on a more kind of annual cycle, often they go out and do a field work project in a summer and then do work during the winter to oversimplify things, and then go back on a seasonal basis, as opposed to what perhaps most of us here are used to in the commercial sector, where projects are very much on a project funded process. And to again just sort of run through one of the key points we found, I'm trying to emphasize here, is that data travels through this process. So yes, we get stratigraphic data at the excavation stage, and that can be assessed in different. Again, there was a question around how much assessment goes on those sort of university-based projects as opposed to commercial projects. But clearly, some of our data, things like phasing and grouping and how we interpret that stuff, isn't actually even in the record. It doesn't exist till someone has done post-excavation. So what ends up in the archive, it often, if you've got purely data from an excavation stage, isn't going to have a lot of that phasing information. If you're looking for artifacts that have been, or settlements that have been identified as having been of the Bronze Age period, they probably won't have identified a lot of that material until they've gone through analysis and then into publication, and obviously finally into the archive. And I'm just making a shout out for data management plans there, that it's traveling, understanding how that data is traveling through that process. It would be useful to have a way of updating data management plans so that travels there through that process as well. And the ultimate aim is to make sure that we can go back and the data that we put into the archive is there for the next person to come along and reuse again. And again, having a data management plan that makes it understood what stages that data has traveled through is very important. Just to say, there are other ways that this can be set out, and Taryn Nixon put it through, like for WSIs, how that can be identified. My point here is also it's not a linear process, it's more of a research cycle process, and we go through on a research cycle so that you're making data reusable for the next person. So we had these issues, really, that the matrix in the end, the issue was that although the units had consistent process for how they worked with their data, when it came to what ended up in the archive, we couldn't find, to some extent, a consistent method for how everybody was doing their post-excavation. And I thought, okay, we will just go to talk to people, and maybe they wouldn't have a published hand or guidance on what they were doing, but they would have their own internal guidance. But as it turned out, even that, I mean, some of the organisations had stuff, but it was quite out of date, and they weren't really, they were working to sort of practices which they weren't necessarily going to share with other people, or we could simply put together. And that's where the idea for the handbook, the Archaeologist's Guide to Good Practice handbook came out. As I say, what we have produced focused primarily and particularly on stratigraphic analysis and what goes on in post-excavation. I have presented this at international conferences now, and I'm still going to say this. I've now talked to people across Europe, and it seems that this doesn't. It's not just something that we don't have in the UK. They don't have. They're saying, I haven't had anyone come up to me yet and say, yes, we've got one. Here's an example. But if you have, please let me know. I'll talk a bit more about that stuff as I go through. So one of the things we identified in this handbook, and we have been working on this, and we put it up online, and I'll say a bit more about that. One of the things that we really wanted to identify, again, in terms of reuse of data in archives, was to try and get consistency in what the outputs would be from post-excavation and leading through to what people needed for publications. But we're keen to actually highlight the good practice examples that do end up in the archive. And some of these, we've worked with ADS. I've got an example here where we downloaded some of the outputs, something that MOLA have called the Index of Archaeological Association. That's what it's called up on the ADS. And in fact, that's the CSV file that I downloaded from ADS, turned it into spreadsheets, and we've worked through that. But the point in the handbook was also we're trying to identify that people have different items as they go through post-excavation, things like phase plans, revised and updated matrices, and also trying to suggest good practice in terms of what digital formats they could deposit. And I want to do more work with ADS about how we can kind of map that to good exemplars so that people can go through and follow it through. At the moment, you can follow through some of it through on the handbook, and I'll say a bit more. The key here is about enabling the findability and reuse of the data. If you want to do synthesis, then you have to have enough consistency in these data records to be able to join stuff up. I'm not saying that individual organizations aren't doing good practice in their internal work or their organizational work, but it's when you come to trying to work across data sets that are from different organizations that a lot of the issues are starting to arise. For those that want to look, that is the web address. It's up online. I must make sure to credit that this was the work of we had a lot of workshops and focus groups with a whole bunch of practitioners from a major union, and people came to focus groups and contributed, and we put this up through Google Docs, so it was shared docs, and we revised versions and versions. And credit to all those people. Those people are acknowledged on the website. I can't acknowledge them all here, but thanks if any of you are in the room who took part in this. And I'll leave it at that for now. Go and have a look if you. What I wanted to also talk more about today was kind of like other things we can do with this going forward. The idea we start with the stratigraphic analysis as the case study, but clearly there are other elements of post-excavation that could also perhaps benefit in a modular way. There are already toolkits, and I'll say a bit more with CIFA toolkits, so there are areas that are covered, like some of the sort of pottery and coin recording, but I think that there are also things to do with dating that we could do some further guidance on as well. And really the key here is between the gaps that we encountered in the what was ending up in the archives. I think we're like looking at what were the causes behind that, and I think, well, I'm saying here professional development gaps. I think post-excavation skills is something that is not commonly taught at university courses, and to some extent it's also how it develops. From what I could gather sort of through commercial units, it's very much a kind of on-the-job approach to how people pick these things up. And often field workers, it will take 10 or more years before someone has become enough experience in the field and they then get to write up a site. And that is what a lot of people have been saying, and it came up again in the sort of lessons learned from yesterday's session on post-excavation as well. But those skills post-ex skills are crucial for analysing and preserving and effectively fair sharing the finds and results, to have that. And I think, make a case for structured training programs to emphasise, that's the kind of way we might be able to fill some of these gaps and improve what's ending up in the archive records. So recommendations are coming out of this was best practice guidelines and other updates, potentially other structured programs. And again, it will need work from the people running university courses as well, and we want to try and produce resources that can be used both within commercial work and for students coming into the sector. As I say, I've probably said some of this already. There's a lot of archaeological graduates are leaving their courses without really much understanding of PX work. There are field courses. People go out and do excavation work and summer excavation work, but to what extent they get to do certainly maybe some artifact processing, but less and less around what they actually need for doing post-excavation. And I would argue, one of the real key win-wins of this would be if we could get more of these skills out to people in the field and encourage and get their understanding of how information is used in post-excavation. That would have I think it would have a real benefit on the quality of the actual field records as well. virtuous circle there, that the data itself from excavation and recording, their understanding of what they're doing in the field would be improved if you have a better understanding of how that information is going to be used or needs to be used when it goes through to post-excavation and grouping and phasing processes and matrix analysis as well. Yes, and again, CPD, and I'll come on to a little bit more about how we can embed some of that as well in CPD. Yeah. So we're proposing, we've produced an online best practice guide. We're also, and as I said, there's potential for other kind of modular handbook approach. My colleagues, as I say, James working at York University is keen to try and develop things like potentially MOOCs, which could then be used for professional CPD as well as student teaching, workshops and day schools, talking with people again at universities how we might bring in, have university day schools, but also include professionals in that, how to share these resources for teaching, and a big shout out for the idea of mentoring programs and potentially apprenticeships, but mentoring programs in particular. And my colleague, you probably see my colleague Phil Pollard walking around with his advertising banner around these archaeology mentoring partnership grants. And I do argue that stratigraphic analysis is a post-excavation skill. So if anyone wants to do put in for a mentoring grant to do post-excavation stratigraphic analysis with a suitable early careers person, then talk to Phil. We have produced a series of recommendations. We're working on publications where we will put out more of these recommendations for the commercial sector, recommendations for education, and really sort of challenges and further considerations. I think the key one there is future-proofing this and strategies so that we can keep some of these materials up to date, as I say, as digital practice continues to advance, as new digital technologies come in. Drawing to a close, but I also want to just add that as part of all this, going back to sort of why I was trying to get to some of this data for reuse. One of the new projects that I'm working on, and I should have credited, we got Leverhulme Trust funding for this project called QA, is Quantifying Uncertainty in Expert Archaeological Dating Evidence. We're looking at ways in which not only that, we know people have found Bayesian chronological analysis and modeling useful for scientific dating, and my colleagues, the back of Alex Baylis's head there, lying on the site hut at Chattel Hewick. Thanks, James Taylor was out at Chattel Hewick, so and he took this photo. But this is Alex having to try and wrestle with the Chattel Hewick matrix diagram because in paper. But we're hoping that potentially, if we get better dating evidence in the records, we may be able to advance some of the Bayesian modeling techniques on actual finds data as well, and be able to look at how you might certain finds evidence might also be used for Bayesian modeling alongside or alternative to more expensive C14 dating or scientific dating. So the plan, and we have a plan to take this forward, and we mentioned this morning about the 21st Century Challenges for Archaeology Programme, historically in funding. CIFRA are putting forward a proposal to make a toolkit. At the moment, the AG to GP, the Archaeologist Guide to Good Practice website is up online and it's there for people to look at. We also think it very much is quite close in format to the existing CIFRA toolkits, and we want to integrate. We have integrated to some extent with the CIFRA toolkits already, where we can point to them. Obviously, point to ADS, as I said earlier, about some of their guides to good practice. But there are. So we plan to hopefully transpose the existing guide into a CIFRA toolkit where it works, and we've included already glossaries within, or a glossary within our handbooks. We want potentially, well, the reason going back to why I did the projects in the first place, to do work on the semantics, get some consistency in what people are talking about in their data and how they're actually categorizing their data, which will really help with some of the sort of technology we talked this morning about linked open data and ways you can search for things, how we can also better signpost the outputs that people are producing so people can actually find it and reuse it. And just to conclude, so I'm calling this, my idea is re-engineer. I think the key is that we kind of re-engineer some of our processes for reuse, really focusing on the reuse part of FAIR, which I think is what we all really want to make the most of. And perhaps avoid, there was some mention of PDFs, so we're trying to avoid just producing PDFs and rather making more of our data actually in primary digital formats like CSV files, simple things that people can download and reuse, not just turning matrix diagrams into PDFs in the back of reports, and then some poor person is faced with trying to retype it all back in. We need to recycle for sharing between humans, not, you know, FAIR data is originated as metadata for machines, so we also need to make sure it's available for humans to reuse. And again, shouting out, data management plans will help if you have good data management planning and use of FAIR principles, so that we can share some of our data across geopolitical and spatio-temporal boundaries. Thank you.